McCarthyism, Whitaker Chambers, Alger Hiss, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Paul Robeson, House Un-American Activities Committee, the Smith Act, the Hollywood 10, the Joint Anti-Fascist Committee, the Truman Loyalty Program, the Blacklist, book burning, and communism. All subjects of controversy during the 30s, 40s, and 50s here in the United States. Clay Risen, a reporter and editor at the New York Times, has a fresh look at all this in his book, Red Scare. Mr. Risen writes in his preface that his grandfather was a career FBI agent who joined the Bureau during World War II, and he recounted stories of implementing loyalty tests for the federal government in the late 1940s. Clay Risen, you say in your book there's a guy named John Parnell Thomas who went to prison. And when you find out what he's all about, what was he doing in prison and who was he?
So he was the chairman of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which we know as HUAC. He took over in 1947 when the Republicans took back control of the House. And he was the first to really weaponize HUAC and to take advantage of its subpoena power to go after people who were alleged communists. So his first big target was Hollywood. And he was the, I guess you'd say, mastermind behind the Hollywood 10 and the confrontation with screenwriters and producers who were accused of having communist ties. And as you point out, the irony is they all went to jail. But then Parnell Thomas was caught in a corruption scandal, and he ended up in the same prison at the same time with two of the Hollywood 10.
He was a Republican, if my memory is correct.
That's correct.
But why did Harry Truman, a Democrat, pardon him?
It's weird politics of the Cold War. And look, I mean, Thomas wasn't the world's worst criminal. And I think, Truman certainly saw some advantage in giving him a handout. But, he didn't recover his political career. That was for sure.
How many people went to prison in that whole era?
Yeah. So, when you're talking about people who went to prison for contempt, it was, a little over 100. This is contempt of Congress. Then there are people who went to prison for because they were prosecuted and convicted under the Smith Act, which prevented or made illegal essentially membership at the top levels in the Communist Party. And there you had, a couple of dozen people who were either went to prison or were on their way to prison when the Supreme Court finally overturned or sort of pared back a lot of the extensiveness of the Smith Act. So these people largely avoided prison in the end. But, ultimately we're talking about a couple of hundred people who spent time behind bars during the Red Scare. But that's only a small fraction of what you might call the victims of the Red Scare.
When you started doing your research, what most surprised you about things that you didn't know about?
I think the thing that continued to interest me and continued to reveal nuances for me was the depth of the Red Scare. I think that in our common historical understanding, we think of it as something that happened in Washington, something that happened in Hollywood with the Blacklist. But the Red Scare, those were the nuclei of the Red Scare. And so much of it happened at the state level, at the local level. It was very much a grassroots movement as much as it was a top-down movement. And it was also a private sector movement. You had companies, civic organizations, the very bonds of our society became outlets for hunting supposedly communist influences in the most far-flung, small towns around the country. And people who had no relationship at all to national security were suddenly liable to be suspect and punished, essentially, for any connections to radicalism they might have had long in the past.
When did you first get interested?
So I first started working on the book in 2019, but the interest that I have really goes back to, I'd say, my grandfather, who was an FBI agent. And when I was growing up, he would tell us stories, my brother and me, about his various escapades as an agent. And one of them was an anecdote he would tell about how he had to go investigate a guy who, this is in Chicago, who is accused of being a communist. And, he went and talked to him, and the guy said, well, I'm not a communist. I own my shop on the corner. I fly the American flag, but you should investigate, Mr. Luger across the street. He's a Nazi. He's a fascist. And so my grandfather would go interview him, and he would say, what are you talking about? My son's in the military. I've been here for years. I bought war bonds. And so he'd kind of scratch his head, and he'd go interview other neighbors. And they would say, oh, you talk to, Winkleman and Luger, they hate each other. And it would, they've been fighting over the same, like their parking space for years or whatever. And, it turns out that these guys were using the FBI to they were acting as informers just to take shots at each other. And, it's kind of a funny story and nothing happened, but it stuck with me because that was the atmosphere at the time, that you could just make up a story about somebody. You could abuse the fear that was, in some ways justified at the dawn of the Cold War to attack your neighbors, go after your enemies. And in that little kernel of a funny Chicago street anecdote is a lot of what happened on a grand scale during the Red Scare.
Did you do anything with those stories that your grandfather told you in any other venue, like a high school, college paper, or anything like that?
No, it sort of stuck at the back of my head. And this is at least how I work on book projects, is a lot of times I'll have anecdotes, little details that I've picked up through the course of my life. Another one is my high school. This is in Nashville, Tennessee. My high school was the Big Red. That was our mascot, like the Harvard Crimson, the Stanford Cardinal. But during the 1950s, we changed our name to the Big Maroon. And as a kid, I definitely went and asked people who had been around at the time, why was that? No one would say it, but everyone kind of understood that it was because red was the color of communists and we couldn't be red. So that was another thing that just sort of stuck in the back of my head. And later, as I was looking for a book project, these things started to congeal into, a set of premises, a set of questions that led me to the book.
I'm not going to try to go chronologically through all this. And that's what somebody can go buy the book and get it in a much better sense than me jumping all over the place or going through it. But one of the things that did catch my attention as I'm reading it, and I made a list of them, about how many people died around these stories. And I'll just pick out Harold Ware. Tell us who he was. He died at age 45 in 1935 in a car accident. What was he up to during that time period?
Yeah, so Harold Ware was a government official, a sort of, you'd maybe say a lower tier brain trust guy. During the New Deal, thousands of people, very well-educated people flowed into Washington and other places to work for the New Deal. It was seen as the place for the best and the brightest. And of course, we're in a depression at the time, so it's not like there were other opportunities. So people like Ware, who is at the Agriculture Department, he came to Washington, and a lot of these people were idealists, and a lot of them, or some number of them, not a lot of them, but a small number, had pretty radical ideals. And Ware was one of several people who often certainly unbeknownst to his employers, but unbeknownst even to his colleagues, was working for the Soviet Union, and he built up what later was understood to be a cell of informants, and he did it through a kind of a sort of interesting way. He would gather people, like-minded people, for conversations. Let's talk about what's going on with the economy. Let's talk about what's going on with social inequality. And he would use that to kind of feel people out and find out, how radical are you? What are your thoughts on American politics? And then from those groups, some of whom were communists, he would select a few people that he would then reveal as he would reveal himself as an agent, and he would say, if you ever find anything interesting, let me know about it, and I can pass it on to the right people. So Harold Ware died in a car accident, and a lot of the people that were under him, went on to pretty significant roles either in the government or in industry. But there are a lot of other people like Ware. There were several large cells in the New Deal, especially in the 1930s. It kind of petered out after a while. But these were the kernels of an espionage effort by the Soviet Union built into the Roosevelt administration.
Before I forget to ask you this, you talked about the Hollywood 10. Who in that group would we know today? And how many of them went to prison?
Yeah, so all of the Hollywood 10 went to prison. And the one that most people know is Dalton Trumbo. And, there's been a great documentary about him. There was a great movie about him with Bryan Cranston that, is pretty true to his character. Cranston does a great job portraying Trumbo. Yeah, he was a larger than life writer, and he's probably the most talented of the Hollywood 10. He wrote a lot about his experience, and he, more than anyone else in the Hollywood 10, managed to survive the Blacklist. So at the end of the Blacklist, kind of in the late 50s, early 60s, he came back as a screenwriter. He wrote Spartacus. He worked on, a number of other sort of seminal early 60s films. The only other name, Ring Lardner Jr., probably most famous because he was Ring Lardner's son. But I think one of the things that's telling about the Blacklist is or the Hollywood 10 and the Blacklist generally is how few people we know. And that's a result of the Blacklist in many cases. A lot of people, these were younger, up and coming folks. Their lives were cut off as far as Hollywood was concerned. A lot of people ended up just going into other fields. So people who were famous at the time, or they were no longer famous, and people who were thought of as rising stars, they were simply snuffed out career-wise.
Another early death of a heart attack was Harry Dexter White. That was in 1948. What role did he play in your story?
Yeah, so Harry Dexter White is another guy who was revealed to be a Soviet agent or to have been passing information to the Soviets. But, he's an interesting case because it was the FBI, quite clearly proved, I think, that he was a spy, that he was feeding information to the Soviets or had done that in the past. And the Roosevelt administration and then the Truman administration largely fobbed that off. And he was working at the Treasury Department, and then he was promoted to be the head of the IMF. And we say promoted for Truman. I think he thought that this was a way to get White kind of out of the immediate orbit of U.S. policy, put him in an international organization. And so he was called before House Un-American Activities Committee, and he was grilled, aggressively. He said at one point, "Look, I've got a heart condition. It would be really great if you could give me some breaks during this." And they refused. And a few days after his hearing, he died. And the important thing is that at the time, it wasn't really understood. There was no consensus around what he had done. And so there were a lot of people who defended him and said there's no way that Harry Dexter White spied for the Soviet Union. And it became a black mark for the House Un-American Activities Committee, even as it was making pretty good progress in other regards. And I think this is one of the important things I try to get in my book, is that while we can recognize the venality of the Red Scare and look at individual characters and how they abuse their power and went after ghosts in the name of whatever, opportunism or ideology, there was a there. I mean, there was an issue, at least retrospectively, with Soviet espionage. The American Communist Party was, at the top levels, a tool of the Soviet Union. And so the FBI and others were right to be concerned about these things. And they were right to pursue cases as national security concerns and as law enforcement issues. The point that I try to make in my book is that that's where it should have remained. And yet it became this all-encompassing cultural issue. And like I said, this grassroots witch hunt. And that's where the real problem with what the Red Scare was comes in.
Again, this is a bit out of context, but it's a story I want to ask you about. It was about Fred Vinson, the Chief Justice, and William O. Douglas, and the Rosenbergs. It's rather complicated, but tell us as much as you can about the intrigue around their execution.
Yeah, so the Rosenbergs had been found guilty of spying for the Soviet Union, and they were sentenced to death. As we know, this was Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and there was a lot of debate on two things. The first was, should they be executed? Right, regardless of what they did, should they be executed? And even within the government, there was a lot of debate about that. There was a lot of debate on the Supreme Court about that. But the other question was, had they been tried under the right law? Because there was a law that allowed execution as a punishment for treason or for espionage, but they had actually been tried under a different law that did not permit that, or they had been convicted under it. And so this case was, their lawyers brought this case to William O. Douglas, who was, one of the great civil libertarians in Supreme Court history, and certainly during the Red Scare. And Douglas had kind of waffled a little bit on the Rosenberg question, but the lawyers persuaded him, we need to hit pause on this. We need to at least consider this question. And so he issued a stay of execution, and then he went on vacation. And by vacation, he meant getting in a car by himself and driving back home to Yakima, Washington. And as he was making his way across Pennsylvania, he heard on the radio that Chief Justice Vinson, without talking to him about it, had reversed the stay. And that was a breach of decorum. It was a breach of respect for Douglas. It was questionable whether Vinson he certainly had the capacity to do it, but whether he should have in any context. So Douglas turned around, drove back to Washington as quickly as possible. And, what followed was an enormous fight within the Supreme Court and among the justices. And by fight, I mean, people, clerks around adjacent rooms and down the hall could hear Felix Frankfurter and Hugo Black yelling at Fred Vinson, along with Douglas, saying, this is an abomination, this is an atrocity. And ultimately, we're not even saying they shouldn't be executed. We just think due process requires us to consider the lawyer's case. And Vinson and the majority simply overruled them and said, nope, we're going to go ahead. We're going to permit the execution, and that's it. And a few days later, they were executed.
And Vinson dies a few days later. Yeah.
Frankfurter, who was also considered a liberal at the time, he said, I don't believe in God, but if I ever needed proof, that's it. He hated Vinson so much. And Vinson was one of the worst Supreme Court justices in history, largely because, there were a lot of, not just the Red Scare, but there were a lot of other questions around desegregation of schools, a lot of the things that became Supreme Court triumphs under his successor, Earl Warren, Vinson didn't know how to deal with them. And he didn't know how to balance the conservatives and liberals on his court. And it just fell apart. And so, and it's one of the reasons why I think the Red Scare went on as long as it did, because the Supreme Court refused as a body to step in for years.
What years do you consider the Red Scare to be most prevalent?
So I tell, my story runs from 1946, the beginning of 1946, up until 1957, when the Supreme Court under Warren issued a series of rulings that rolled back a lot of the Red Scare, the architecture of the Red Scare. Now you could expand it further into the past. There's certainly a lot of legacies of the Red Scare that continue past to 1957. People were still called in front of HUAC. They were still found in contempt. The Blacklist continued for a few more years. But I think those two end zones, for me, kind of define the real period of hysteria that gripped the country.
I should ask you, as I'm beginning to point to a question I want to ask you, whether this was done on purpose. Your prologue opens with Helen read Bryan, are the first three words in the prologue, and it ends in the epilogue with Helen read Bryan. Did you plan that on purpose?
I did. And, Helen Reed Bryan for me is this character, this woman who embodies so much of both the tragedy of the Red Scare, but also I think in her own quiet way, the strength that it took people to stand up to it. She was the first person. She was we're executive secretary of a group that helped refugees. She was the first person found in contempt of Congress by HUAC, and she went to jail for it. And then she was hounded by the FBI. She couldn't get a job, and she ended up in retirement. But when the FBI went and tried to talk to her, this is in 1957, she refused. She said, I don't want to talk to you anymore. I'm done with you all. And there's a strength in that that I found appealing. I mean, the other thing is, Helen Bryan was not a communist, but she was a leftist. She had strong ideals, and she was, I think, ultimately punished for those ideals. And she is, for me, the archetype of so many people who, in the 1930s, developed or came around to, fairly progressive ideas about where the country was going, and who, in the late 1940s, essentially suffered for those same beliefs.
What did she do the rest of her life?
She spent a couple of years fighting the conviction, and she ended up going to jail. The Supreme Court, under Vinson, refused to hear her case. And afterward, she tried to find work she worked at the Salvation Army for a while. She worked for a women's prison up in Massachusetts. She wrote a book about her experience in prison, and it sold pretty well because people wanted to hear her story of being a victim of the Red Scare. She was more interested in prison reform, and the book is very much about reforming women's prisons. So she tried to make that her next career, but every time she would get a job, the FBI would visit her employer and say, you know who this woman is, right? Maybe you shouldn't employ her. And she would be fired. And so eventually she had some health setbacks, and she was already, late 50s at this point. And so she retired to a family, a home that her family owned in rural Vermont. And then, but managed to carve out a life for herself there as a local, joined her church, joined a local church, taught classes locally, adult education classes, did what she could with the ideals that she held. I think the remarkable thing about her is that she remained true to herself.
How many years did you spend in Tennessee?
Well, so I moved there when I was a little kid, and I let's see, so about 10 years until I left for college. So, elementary school on through high school.
What were your parents doing there?
My dad was from there, and he had gone away for college and then was working in upstate New York for Corning, actually, the glass company. And he always wanted to get back to Tennessee. So when a job opportunity opened with the company that no longer exists called Northern Telecom, they had a big operation in Tennessee. They said, we'd love for you to move back. You can move with your family. So we moved back to Nashville. He moved back to Nashville, and we came with him. So, I have complicated feelings about Tennessee. I love it in a lot of ways. It is home for me. I'm not quite that kind of person who says I wasn't born here, but I got here as soon as I can. But I like going home.
Where'd you go to college?
I went to Georgetown University, the Foreign Service program.
Foreign Service?
Yeah.
Where was your first journalism job?
My first journalism job, my first real journalism job, was at the New Republic. I sort of scraped around freelance work and some what you might call journalism adjacent jobs, writing copy for websites and things like that. But then I got a break and got hired at the New Republic in 2003.
And then what?
So I was there for a few years, and it was really interesting. I got there right before the Gulf War or the Iraq War started. And so I got to see the debates in the editorial room about that, but also to be in Washington at the time was pretty interesting, and to get an education in that, at least that era of foreign policy politics. So I was there for 3 years, and then I moved to a new journal. It's called Democracy. It's still around. It's one of these. We don't have many of them anymore, but it's one of those little, almost book-like journals, come out quarterly in the model of public interest or national interest. And so I was there for 4 years, and then honestly, I was looking to settle down. My wife and I were looking to have kids and buy a house in the suburbs in DC, and I got an offer to come to the Times. And so everything changed, and here we are. 15 years later, I'm still at the New York Times.
And your job now at the Times?
So I was on the op-ed desk for years and ended up as the deputy there. And then I worked on the politics desk during the 2020 election. And since then, I've been writing obituaries. And I'm doing that even today.
All right. I'm sure you've never been asked this question. What is your relationship to James Risen?
James is, if we're talking, he's a cousin of mine. Technically, he is my father's first cousin, one of my father's first cousins. So he is my first cousin once removed. But we're not distant. We keep in touch pretty frequently.
Were you at the Times together?
We were. Yeah, we overlapped. But with, I think about I forget when he left exactly, but I think it was, obviously he was here when I got here. I think he left in 2016, maybe 2015. He was based and still is in DC. So it's not like we saw each other every day, but if he was up in the New York office or I was down in DC, we would get together.
Back to your book, and I want to ask you what Truman's loyalty program was.
So the loyalty program was created by an executive order by the Truman administration, and it was a response to pressure that was coming to Truman, both from the FBI and Hoover, saying, look, we have pretty good evidence that there was recently or still is, a group of Soviet spies in the U.S. government. But also political pressure. The Democrats had lost big in the 1946 midterm elections. Republicans had ran on an anti-communist platform. And also the Cold War was starting. And Truman wanted to look strong. But he didn't really believe that communism or communist espionage was a real problem. beyond kind of a law enforcement and specific, discrete national security problem. So he created this program that, was essentially just reviewing the loyalty of every federal employee and every applicant. And he thought, as he said later, that this would be a pretty simple process, just another bureaucratic box. But it ended up metastasizing and becoming a huge problem for the civil liberties of millions of federal workers. The idea was that there would be a background check into everybody, and if there was even the slightest evidence of some connection to somebody who might be considered disloyal by whatever means, whatever that meant, and it was largely undefined, then there would be a full FBI investigation, field investigation into those. And this happened thousands of times. And if that showed anything, there would be a hearing. And oftentimes, if you got to the hearing, your career was over. You might be fired, you might be pushed aside. But the problem was that the FBI didn't have to present the evidence for the hearing. The FBI could simply say, we have evidence. We can't say where we got it. We can't say who provided it to us. Essentially, the accused had no opportunity to confront their accuser or really to know what they were accused of. And there was also an incentive on the part of everybody involved to, find communists. The line was, if you create a witch hunt, you better find witches. And so they kept finding people they accused of being witches. And hundreds of employees were fired from the federal government. Thousands were demoted or they had their careers sidelined. No spy, no evidence of any espionage or subversion was ever found. The program was, in that regard, completely useless.
When did the loyalty program stop?
So Truman's loyalty program technically stopped in 1953 when Eisenhower created his own program. And it's important, the distinction is important. Eisenhower said it wasn't enough to look at someone's loyalty. You can't really assess someone's loyalty. It's hard to do. He said, look, it's both ineffective and unfair. What we need to do is look at someone as a security risk. And someone might be a security risk because they're disloyal. You might be a security risk because you're an alcoholic and you're vulnerable to Soviet blackmail. Infamously under this category was gay employees. If you were accused or found to be gay, that was seen as a security risk. And so, thousands of gay men and women were kicked out of the federal government for that. The security program lasted for several more years. Now, the 1957 Supreme Court decisions, one of the things they did was to start to really pare that back and put in place protections. But and eventually it just wasn't used anymore. And I'm gonna have to pass on the year that it was ended officially. But it was one of these things where, as a tool, it remained, but as something that was implemented, it became less and less useful and less frequent.
The story of Elizabeth Bentley.
Yeah, so Elizabeth Bentley is sort of, people know the story of Whitaker Chambers, or a lot of people do, but Elizabeth Bentley kind of gets forgotten. But in a lot of ways, she was the proto Whitaker Chambers. Like him, she had worked for the Soviet espionage network in the U.S. She was a communist, and like Chambers, she had decided that there was a bad idea, and that she had reasons to fear for her life. They both saw what was happening in the Soviet Union with Stalin's terrors and decided their lives were at risk. So she went immediately, or she left, went underground, and then went to the FBI and said, not only do I want to confess what I did, but I know a lot of names. And at first, the FBI was suspicious of her because she had some pretty grand claims as to what she knew. She had reason to do it. She had been a courier for spy networks in D.C. up to New York, where the kind of headquarters of the spy network was. And so she had an opportunity to see a lot of people and to know a lot of names. So at first, the FBI was a little suspicious, but then it started to come around to her. And the FBI interviewed her extensively. At first, didn't do a lot with what she told them. And eventually, she was called in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee and its sort of parallel operation in the Senate to tell them what she knew. And again, what she said was pretty grandiose, and some of it was wrong. I mean, a lot of the things, unlike Chambers, she was not especially sophisticated in the way that she approached the information she had. So she was, saying a lot of things that could be easily disproven, making claims about people she had seen who she didn't see. And ultimately, she sort of left them with a dilemma, because how much do you rely on her? Also, unfairly to her, she was, at this point, public. And, newspapers made a lot about the female, the woman spy. And she was objectified in the press. And that's where Chambers came in, because Chambers could confirm a lot of what she said. And so when Chambers was brought forward, initially, Chambers was just there to say, yeah, Elizabeth Bentley is telling the truth about X, Y, and Z. But the thing that really jumped out, she had named Alger Hiss, but she wasn't sure about the name. She said, I think I remember him. Maybe it was Arnold. Maybe it was something Hiss. And Chambers confirmed that. And he said, absolutely, Alger Hiss was a spy. And that's where everything blew up. So in some ways, you can sort of think of Elizabeth Bentley as the person who opened the door to the Hiss Chambers drama that occupied, the American public for years.
What happened to her?
Well, she sort of drifted. She was, like a lot of people in American celebrity life. She had her 15 minutes and then, largely just receded. She wrote a book. She went back to kind of a quiet private life and, ended up dying relatively young. She wasn't that old, but yeah, she sort of, I think that's in America, at least, that's sort of a common trope for people who occupy a position like her is, they find themselves unexpectedly thrust into the limelight. They do as much as they can with it. And pretty quickly, they find themselves cast back out.
I want to read you a quote that you have in your book because it really goes right to something you read all the time about this man. It may not sound significant. You'll know where to pick it up. The literary critic Lionel Trilling, who encountered Chambers, meaning Whitaker Chambers, when they were both at Columbia as undergraduates, wrote, quote, when the mouth opened, it never failed to shock by reason of the dental ruin it disclosed, a devastation of empty sockets and blackened stumps. Why did you put that in your book?
So, Chambers was a very interesting character, and he was, both, I think, it's fair to say he was in some ways repulsive, not just physically. He didn't take care of himself physically. He was, as that anecdote carries through, he was brusque. He was always carried a lot of weight on his shoulders. The fact that Trilling zeroed in on that about him when he was an undergraduate says a lot. And Trilling wrote that years later, but, was remembering him. But at the same time, Chambers was a deeply idealistic individual, and both as a communist and then as an anti-communist. And I think he's a fascinating character for that reason. Sam Tannenhouse, my former colleague, wrote a phenomenal biography of Whitaker Chambers called Chambers. And I think that book really captures this duality of this man who was easy to reject. And that's what happened to him, right? A lot of people who heard his charges, who saw him on TV or in the newspaper, very quickly rejected him and said, this guy can't possibly be telling the truth. Look at it. Even Richard Nixon, who became one of his strongest defenders, initially said, this guy is a rumpled suit. He's, he looks like an alcoholic. I don't trust him. And he came around to trust him. And it's one of the many complexities of this story that, this character who was so easily reviled was, I believe, telling the truth. And when he revealed what he knew about Alger Hiss, he was doing it from a point of honesty. And he became a kind of a Rorschach test for a lot of people at the time. If you were strongly anti-communist to begin with, you would see through a lot of the surface of Chambers and say what he's saying deep down is true. If you were not necessarily communist, but if you were liberal or opposed to the Red Scare, or however you want to characterize that, you would look at Chambers and say, this guy is self-evidently untrustworthy. And so, I included it to kind of help people understand like these layers to this person that begins with literally the superficial physical characteristics of him and go down from there.
Do you know anyone that still thinks Alger Hiss was innocent?
I do. In fact, there's a new book out that is by Jeff Kisselhoff that makes the case that Hiss was innocent and makes a case that there was a grand conspiracy against him. I haven't read Kisselhoff's book, and I don't want to make a claim about the accuracy of his investigation, but I do think that it's telling that the case for Hiss at this point rests on the premise that there was a grand conspiracy against him. And as a historian, I will just say I have a knee-jerk reaction to any claims about the truth that are rooted in a conspiracy theory, right? And that's not to say conspiracies don't happen. Of course, there are lots of stories where that's true, but as a starting point, it's not the best foot. And I think there's an enormous amount of evidence, and honestly, pretty compelling evidence, that supports the case that Hiss was a spy. And when you come down to just Occam's razor, is it more likely that Hiss was a spy, or was it likely that there was this conspiracy between forces unknown and Chambers and other sorts of nefarious characters to set Hiss up for reasons that also are not entirely clear? So anyway, all of that is to say that yes, there are still people who believe him, and people I respect who believe that Hiss was innocent, but I personally don't. I think he was guilty.
You also talk about the Venona papers in your book. I've interviewed tons of people where the Venona papers come up in the book. What can you tell us about the Venona papers and when they started, and why are people referencing it so often in the last several years?
Well, it's one of the reasons why I wanted to write my book was that, the Venona papers, which, just as a recap, was sort of the revelation that the United States government for a long time had been able to crack the codes of Soviet spy masters here in the US communicating with Moscow. And so they knew a lot. And in fact, the Venona papers were so top secret that the evidence that they produced was not used during the Red Scare, during trials, for example, because that would reveal the presence of this project. So it was only in the 90s that the Venona papers, the Venona project was revealed. And it's pretty damning. Up until then, there had been a lot of, at least, capacity for debate about were the Rosenbergs guilty? Was Hiss guilty? Was, this or that aspect of the Red Scare? And the Venona papers, combined with the brief opening of archives in the Soviet Union, shifted the grounds of that debate and really kind of put an end to a lot of the claims for innocence on the part of accused spies. And the reason why I wanted to write the book is that a lot of the conversation about the Red Scare ended at that point. There had been a debate back and forth between people who said everything about the Red Scare is atrocious. There was no there. There were no Soviet spies. All the people accused of being spies were innocent. And others who said, no, actually, let's consider that the Communist Party was a tool of Moscow, that these people were guilty. Not to excuse the Red Scare, but that's how we need to approach this. And when the Venona papers were revealed, that side kind of won. And it was taken as, for some people, evidence that the Red Scare was therefore acceptable. And so I wanted to restart that conversation with my book and say, let's accept that this evidence that emerged in the 90s is pretty reliable. And yet, let's now talk about what still remains the grossest violation of civil liberties in American history. And how do we tell that story today in light of all this new evidence?
I think I heard you right. You say you're doing the obituary.
That's right.
Responsibility. Yeah. Are you in charge of the obituaries?
No, I'm a reporter. So I find or I get assigned obituary subjects. And it's wonderful. It's actually wonderful training for writing history because every obituary is itself a piece of history. It is a brick in larger histories. It's also great training for writing vividly about people in very concise statements. What we don't do with obituaries is kind of give the broad, essentially a resume of someone's life. We try to find what are the details that bring someone to life, those telling details that in 800 words will make them come alive for readers. And I do that every day. And it was great training for a book like this, where I've never counted, but there must be 30 or 40 somewhat significant characters. It's like a Tolstoy novel. And so how do you make them all feel real to the readers? And my training at Obits has been enormously helpful in that.
One of your colleagues years ago told me that in one of these interviews that one of the things you do at the Times is that on any given page that has obituaries, it's only the top obituary that says the word dies.
Yeah.
Explain why that's the case. And do you have to do it on every page that you have obituaries?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, how much things have changed, because probably when you were speaking to them, everyone paid attention to the print page. Now the print page is really important and we do pay attention to it, but I, as a reporter, have nothing to do with the print page. And I'll look at it the next day, but it's only my editors and then the print. We have a whole team that puts together the paper physically. They pay attention to those things. And a lot of it is really just we still pay a lot. All that said, we pay a lot of attention to the look of the page overall, right? So which photographs we use, how we write the headlines. You want to have a diversity of how you say things. And with obituaries, it can be tricky because the headline is always such and such died. There are, however, different ways to say that. And you can vary it up. And it's still only, it's not like you have all the words in the dictionary to use or all the, possibilities. There are only a few. But anyway, that's why we vary it up. And if you're looking at it online, you might never notice that because you're seeing individual obituaries maybe linked from, X or Facebook or something.
Am I right that I do see obituaries from time to time written by someone who's also died?
Yeah, we do that. We have about 2,000 obituaries that are pre-written. And these are for people whose, their main claim to fame has receded, is long behind them. And so we're able to kind of do, 99%. A funny story about that. So we had an obituary for Henry Kissinger ready. I think the first version was written in the mid 80s. And, not only did he stay alive, but he kept doing things and he kept making news. And so the original author, would have to go back and update it. And then he retired. And so someone else was given the responsibility. And then the original author died. And so at a certain point, I want to say maybe 10, 12 years ago, David Sanger, who's one of our national security writers, we gave him the assignment, just take it all apart, start from zero, write your own version. You can pull stuff from the old one if you want, but take it all again, because it was this Frankenstein of different styles and different authors. And Sanger, he called up Kissinger and said, hey, sorry to do this. You've already sat for so many interviews. Will you sit for another one? And this one's going to be a long interview. And Kissinger said yes. And so Sanger was able to write this whole new obituary for him. Still at the bottom, if you go to see that article, at the bottom, it has the original author's name as a contributor, having contributed to the article. So he still gets credit, but that's one where it just took too long.
Another quote from your book, which goes to kind of a theme behind why people, I guess, followed the communist theology. This one is from Dean Acheson. No, it's not. I apologize. This is from Senator Hugh Butler, who was a senator from Nebraska, who said, put this worldview succinctly when he lashed out at Secretary of State Dean Acheson. Now I'm looking at the quote. The senator said, I look at that fellow, meaning Acheson. I watch his smart aleck manner and his British clothes and that New Dealism in everything he says and does, and I want to shout, get out, get out. You stand for everything that has been wrong in the United States for years. It does sound familiar these days.
It does. And it's really that quote. I love that quote because it goes to the heart of what I was trying to say with the book, which is that obviously the Red Scare happened when it did because of the Cold War and the rivalry with the Soviet Union. But baked into that was a larger, longer running cultural conflict in the United States that started in the 1930s and pitted really two visions of America against each other. And one was embodied by the New Deal, but was bigger than the New Deal. And it was, a cosmopolitan vision, a pluralist vision, one that embraced big government, one that embraced strong relations with Europe, was internationalist. In some ways was Dean Acheson being a great representative of that. And the opposed to that was, a worldview that was isolationist, or at least was not really interested in the world, saw the United States in more traditional terms, was averse to big government, was averse to pluralism, still embraced a fairly hierarchical Christian view of the country. And, this tension emerged during the New Deal, but it was suppressed by the Depression, by the popularity of Roosevelt. And so it's only in the late 1940s that the Cold War gave the opportunity for this conflict to really catch fire. And Butler's quote brings it all together for me. He was going after Acheson because he was accusing, and other people were accusing Acheson of being too friendly with Alger Hiss. That was the context of the quote. But Butler kind of gave the real story away and saying, my problem here is with these guys who are trying to take the country in a different direction. And I hate all of it. And his list, his stereotypes about Acheson show exactly what he was so opposed to. And you're right, it feels very, very not prescient. It feels of the moment today.
Robert Welsh Who was he?
So Robert Welch was the scion of a candy manufacturer who became very political in his mid-career, let's say, and was not just anti-communist, but was convinced that even the Republican Party had been captured by the communists. He believed that Eisenhower himself was a tool of the communists. And he became very close with a group of senators, including Joe McCarthy, but others around McCarthy, who truly believed that the federal government was more or less a tool of Moscow. And he learned of the story of a young man who was an intelligence officer, but also a missionary in China, named John Birch, who had been killed by the communists. And he was so inspired by John Birch's story that he created the John Birch Society. And he brought around him a group of people who kind of shared his radical worldview about the federal government and about American society and the need for radical change. And the John Birch Society really picked up the torch from Joe McCarthy. They were among the 30% of Americans, and this is, so not a small number, who continued to believe that McCarthy was a hero and that McCarthy had been martyred. Essentially McCarthy didn't go far enough. And they carried this through on the fringes, but often not on the fringes. There are times in the subsequent history when the Birch Society or the ideas around the Birch Society made significant inroads into mainstream American society. And I think that, it's fair to say we're in another moment like that today.
I want to wrap up our discussion by asking you about Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson's testimony was on June the 12th, 1956. Who was Paul Robeson, and why would he have been before that committee?
So Paul Robeson was he was a multi-talented man. He was a star athlete at Rutgers. He was a star student at Columbia Law School. He stood out because he was Black at the time. Even in New Jersey and New York, Black men tended not to be on the road to the establishment. And so, he started off a career in law firms, and he was discriminated against, decided that was not for him. He also was a very talented singer and performer. And so he left law and became a world-renowned opera singer. And also, sort of generally, sing all kinds of songs. He performed in, Eugene O'Neill plays. He was a great Othello, as you can imagine. That was the kind of role made for him in his voice. He had a very powerful presence. He was a big man. But starting in the 1920s, he also started to embrace, radical, or let's say, very progressive ideas. And he never became a member of the Communist Party, but he admired the Communist Party. And he became what was known at the time as, a sort of a leading figure for the civil rights movement. We think of the civil rights movement as something that started in the 50s, but it wasn't. It had a much longer history. And Robeson was a leading voice for civil rights. But by the late 1940s, he really started to come out against even other parts of the civil rights movement because he thought that they were not radical enough. He really embraced what later would be known as, a Black Power mentality and a real aversion to what he considered compromise. And he traveled to the Soviet Union. He spoke very warmly of the Soviet Union. He was very naive about the Soviet Union. I think willfully naive about the crimes of Joseph Stalin. And as a result, he was ostracized in the United States, not only by the right, but even parts of the liberal establishment. And he had his passport taken away. He performed at a concert in Peekskill, New York, that set off a mob riot against the attendees, and dozens of people were hurt. And he stopped getting gigs. He essentially stopped performing. So by the time he appeared before that committee, he was, I wouldn't say broken, but definitely he had been weakened. His voice was weaker. He had lost a lot of his strength, both his not his moral strength, but his physical strength and his emotional strength. But he stood up against that interrogation, and I include that in the book because I think it's an interesting sort of corollary with Helen Reed Bryan's story. And I think there's a lot to criticize about Paul Robeson, but ultimately I admire him, and I think he's an admirable character because he stood up for what he believed. He may have embraced ideologies that I don't agree with, but he did so in the name of something I do agree with, which obviously civil rights and racial equality, and he was punished for that, and the fact that he, like Helen Bryan, was able to retain some semblance of self-worth, which I think comes through in that hearing, is noteworthy and honorable. And he should be better remembered today than he is.
Thank you, Clay Risen, for talking to us about your book called Red Scare, which is available in bookstores everywhere.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a real singular honor to be here.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Book Notes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.